as you recall, he did the phase 1 ferry study, and the committee asked him to do a phase 2 that looked at other locations on the island. So Steve this evening is going to do a presentation on his findings from the phase 2 study.
Right, we're going to be presenting the results of the report, but in a presentation.
Should I dim the lights? Would that be better?
Yes.
All right. I have to either, I'm not dim, but turn it off.
Alright, yeah, that'd be better for Rick.
Okay.
Okay. So again, my name is Steve Famularo. I'm with a firm called Ocean and Coastal Consultants, and we are a marine engineering firm. We do a lot of waterfront inspection, rehabilitation, design, permitting throughout New York Harbor, the Northeast, and the U.S. So the presentation today is, I hope to move through it quickly so that we get to the key points for you right now. But the introduction is just going to be a little bit of background on the project. We'll talk about the proposed landing sites that we evaluated, the 4 of them. A little background on the ferry operators that would be providing service to some type of landing that would be on the island. A little talk about the basic construction of typical types of ferry landings that you see throughout New York Harbor. Then I'm going to discuss the evaluation criteria we use to evaluate the 4 different sites, and then review those sites and the 4 sites and how they pertain specifically to those evaluation criteria. And then we'll wrap up with probably the most important things, of course, is the cost and then review any questions that you may have. During the presentation, please feel free to stop me as we go along if you have any further clarification or you have any questions. The primary goal of our study was really to evaluate the optimal location for the ferry landing facility. It wasn't to do a protocol where we were looking at should a ferry service be here. There was a report that was already performed by the New York City Economic Development Corporation that really looked at ferry service throughout the harbor, and it was really a foundation for especially the East River ferry service. But there's been a study that's looked at that ridership and about that. Our study was about finding the best location specifically for that landing. So within that study that was actually performed, Roosevelt Island was very highly ranked. It was ranked number 4 out of a long list of probably almost 40 or 50. I don't know the numbers in the report. But of all the potential areas, Roosevelt Island was very highly ranked. It's actually higher ranked than some of the sites that are currently on the East River ferry system. So there is a real benefit of the need, the evaluation of the demand was there. That demand is only going to increase with the future Cornell facility at the island. So our goals were to really look at the various sites, evaluate them, go out to the sites, take some photographs, evaluate the criteria from a perspective of both the ferry operations and the upland service as well. Figure out how that would integrate into an existing ferry route, how would it integrate into a transportation system on the islands, give some preliminary cost order of magnitude, and then talk about the feasibility of them. So here's a GIS map that we created that shows the 4 landings. They are, I'll come back to it in a sec, so we go back, but we have the observation pier, the former oil dock, the Octagon, and the South Point Park sites. And we have...
The observation pier, is that the prow that's down by the Octagon?
It's the one, the observation pier we've identified as the one right closest to the subway.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the pier, okay.
Yeah, the pier. The one up by the Octagon is called the Octagon site, actually. The South Point Park Landing is very close to Four Freedoms, and the oil dock is right below the Queensboro, pretty much, very close to the tram, the island service. So those are the 4 sites we looked at. Just to give you a little background on the operators that are in the harbor, in case you're not familiar, there's generally 3 primary ones that provide service. The number one in the area right now is the New York Waterway ferry system. New York Waterway and Billy Bay are the 2 companies, and they kind of work together as one. They're primarily a commuter ferry service. However, they do, when they work on the weekends, they provide more service that is generally considered more tourist or recreational on the weekends. In the spring of 2011, the whole East River service began. It was subsidized by the city, and the ridership was projected about 400,000, and they got almost 2.5 times that. And the biggest jump is actually on the weekends. The ferry service on the weekends, they had to actually go to bigger ferry boats because the ridership is just way too high to handle. And it's been going very successfully ever since. It was actually up and running on Wednesday after the storm, too. The storm, by the end of the day Wednesday, we looked at a lot of the sites, and on Thursday morning, the ferry service was back in operation. New York Water Taxi had a long history of trying to develop in the harbor. They've done a great job of, but really focused more so on the tourist, the sightseeing, the specialty type service. They had attempted to get into the commuter market. There was an initial East River Ferry service that had started a few years back, but the newest contract is actually held by New York Waterway. They could be utilized for special access events, and water taxi has a different type of ferry vessel that is actually accommodated by all the ferry landings in the East River Ferry. All of the landings can handle the freeboards that are accommodated by that particular boat. And finally, the C Street is a commuter service, but they're more long range. They mostly run down to Highland, New Jersey. You know, they're much longer runs that they have. You may have seen these boats. They generally run up to 34th Street and to Pier 11. And then after the rush hour, they actually head up the West Channel here and park up by the East 98th Marine Transfer Station. They wait out till the evening rush before their service picks up again. So they're pretty idle during the day. So those are the three primary ferry operators that we have currently providing passenger access throughout the harbor. C Street, like I said, with water taxi, they also are accommodated by all the ferry landings. The reason I say that is there's different freeboards that have to be accommodated, and that really affects.
Tell people what freeboard is.
The freeboard is the height from the waterline to the deck surface. Generally, water taxi and waterway are in the same area. C Street is a lot higher, but all the ferry landings handle that freeboard. So when it comes to the operations, the primary route that we were looking at is point to point. I have a map here as well, but in speaking with the operators, one of the things we found out, and this is kind of some stuff that is a little bit more recent in development, in talking with them, they said that in providing a service to Roosevelt Island, particularly New York Waterway, the way they would most likely handle the service is not to put it on the route that's currently the loop around East River Ferry, but to actually have a shuttle almost that runs consistently between East 34th Street and the island, so they can provide a much more frequent service overall, and that would not interrupt the current route that's going on right now. So you'd effectively transfer at the station, or you get off at 34th Street, get on one of Waterway's buses, and which would take you into the harbor, into the islands, or to other train or bus service. So these are just some of the routes we've shown at how they would actually run to 34th Street.
Did they say that that's the only way they'd consider it, or that was just their first thought?
That was their first thought. I think in our study, and I don't have all the numbers in the presentation, but each of these runs have a very significant time that it takes to go to 34th. The ones on the west side generally can run faster. The ones in the east have a no-wake zone that they're dealing with at 44th Drive primarily. That even though they look closer, they're actually a slower route, and that could greatly impact the overall run. Because the waterway is not dedicating like 10 boats. They've got 2 or 3 boats that they're running on this service. And if you add 20 minutes time to that, that really interrupts their number of cycles that they can handle in the loop. But if they put a smaller boat that runs more frequently just between Roosevelt Island and 34th Street, they can continue the service that they've promised on the East River Ferry route, but then also supplement and handle the ridership that would be coming from Roosevelt Island. So we talked a little bit about the landing sites that we've chosen, the ferries, the routes. I wanted to just show you some of the types of construction that are primarily utilized as a type of landing throughout the harbor. It's generally a floating barge that is the landing itself. That is the access to the barge is provided by a gangway that leads from land onto the barge, and then from there there's actually ramps that are movable ramps that move down once the ferry pulls in, drops down, so that those on the barge can move to and from the ferry. The reason for that is most of these barges are actually 2 and 3 boats that they can handle, and by providing this articulating ramp that onto the ferry, they can make sure they have the ADA compliant access. It's a little harder to handle when you have this wide range of vessels and you have to just transfer them from land with one ramp slope. So that's what the purpose of the ferries are. The other types of facilities are, we have other amenities like electrical connections. We have to provide service for the winches that raise and lower those ramps. upland, you need to have queuing areas for passengers, ticketing, schedule signs, route map signage, and in some cases there's actually shelters when contemplated. So I have a couple of photographs to just give you an idea of types of landings. They're generally similar. This is the one at the same point of the Indy Street Pier. You'd be looking out across the river now over at 14th Street in the Con Ed plant and Sty Cove. So you go down the ramp, and then this is the primary ramp onto the barge. There's two ramps on the left and the right that they look at that are up high. And once the ferries come in, they drop down, and the ramps sit onto the decks of the barge tightly. So there's two bow loaders here, and then the far of the picture is a side loading access where there's some ferries that still do side loading, but in general that's much more for utility. I know NYPD and other different types of harbor patrol vessels will pull up there and access on there. They can even tie up temporarily if they need to. That one is a new one, and this is one of the newest ones. This went in June of 2011, I believe. This one is the North Williamsburg ferry landing. Again, there's two bow loading ramps here, and you see there's a series of monopiles, those individual piles with the big, thicker areas around them. Excuse me, can I just step
Sure,
up?
sorry.
Right here, these are the monopiles with what they're called donut fenders on them because they look like big donuts. They drop them over the top and they float, and as the tide raises and lowers, they stay at the right elevation so that when the boat comes in, they can kind of use them to roll off of. If they hit them, the donuts spin, so that provides a nice gliding path in. They're necessary for these types of ramps because two boats too close together there, you need that separation, and they also prevent them from going into areas that are generally too shallow or areas that it just allows for actually the boats to get in a little bit quicker. They do bounce off them when they're trying to move quickly in and out. So finally, the criteria before we get to some of these sites in depth, we looked at two perspectives. One, engineering, and John, more my type of thing, a lot of physical aspects of the construction of a ferry landing. And then the actual service-related items, travel time, how close they are to various transportation hubs. We have another example here. So I'm going to move past these because I would like to get to the actual discussion. But like one of the things we looked at is how close are these facilities to the existing transportation network that's on the island, the Red Line bus, the subway, etc. So let's talk about the four landings, the pros and the cons. They're being presented in the order of recommendation, and our first order recommended site is actually probably the observation pier landing. The pros, it's the shortest travel time to East 34th Street. It was about 6 minutes. This was actually measured. We were on the ferry one day when they took us for a tour to evaluate some of the way the boats line up. And we went right by this spot and timed it from there to 34th Street, and it's about 6 minutes. So based upon that, you could probably run, 2 to 5 runs an hour, probably more like 4 an hour every 15 minutes. Yes?
So what would the capacity be on these smaller
I don't know. I know that the larger vessels they're running are the 299 ones, and then there's the 149. They have the 149 during the week and the 299 on the weekends. I would bet they'd be the 149, and they might even be smaller than that, like 99.
Okay.
So I have to see what they were talking about.
That's useful. Thank you.
Okay. It's a great location in terms of being centrally located to the existing transportation network on the island, close to the subway, close to the bus. There's actually a bus stop right there. That's not part of my presentation. I'm not trying to sell you selling products.
I don't know.
And then finally, it's there's an existing facility here that appears to be in good condition. It's a great queuing area. There's already a ramp down to it that provides access to it. There's a lot of places to put the signage, to put the ticket machines. There's an infrastructure there that's really well suited for the landing there. Some cons are that you can see them. There's some electrical crossings in this area. We're kind of close to the subway. Anytime you want to do pile driving or work anywhere near the subway, it's a longer review process, so it complicates construction. We have rock pretty high here, so you have to do rock sockets, which are literally drilling holes into the rock to sit the piles into for the landing, and that really causes them to have fits about safety, and it's warranted, but it definitely slows down the process to get through that particular chain. The relative cost of this is generally high compared to the oil dock was a little bit higher, and I think that the west side there of the harbor, the west side of the channel, the East River, you've seen what it's like. It's a very active area. The DEP boats are running up and down. The barges are running up and down. So there's a lot more wake activity, and you're probably going to see a little bit more maintenance requirements on having a landing over there. It's not as quiet, so that could be a problem.
There's one more con on that too. We would be doing away with an island amenity, we just started this year, we had a restaurant down there.
It's possible that you would not. I know what you're talking about. It's possible that we could handle that.
You think so?
Yes,
Okay.
because there's still more of an
side
upland here. It could actually be part of a draw, even where they could say, hey, easy. It's the first stop on the ferry.
So we wouldn't have to eliminate this?
It would change. It would change how you laid out the queuing area. If there was such high ridership, that could be a problem. But I know it's not there on the winter, or it's only a seasonal thing. So when it's not, you can be on the pier. When it is, you can set up a series of maybe put them in the middle of the pier and let them flow around it to get access to queue onto it. I think there's ways to work that out. I don't think that's a deal breaker.
Okay.
The oil dock was actually part of the phase 1 work that we looked at, and it's still a good site overall. I think what ended up for us in giving it a con was the fact that we discovered this no wake zone and the travel time, which can really disrupt the ability to have a frequent cycling of passengers to and from the island. But it's got a lot of pros. It's got that pier that, even though it's not in good condition, it could be rehabilitated. So it does have the potential for an upland space. It's reasonably centrally located to the transportation with the subway on Roosevelt Island. And, I think on this side of the river, you could design a facility that has waterfront recreational use. So you could allow people to get onto a barge and then from there get down onto canoes and kayaks and get onto the east side of the channel, which is generally a lot calmer. There's not nearly the volume of vessel traffic over there. One of the things that we actually evaluated too was visibility in terms of knowledge of service. On the east side, it's kind of hidden from view, whereas if it's on the west side, you can see it. You actually know the ferry service is there. You can see ferries running to it, people driving down the FDR, people that are on the east side of Manhattan can see that this is available to them. So it's a visibility thing as well. This is an example of what we had proposed in our first study, where you could have bow loaders from both sides, and then we actually took the barge in the design and put a little step down there where people could walk down steps and get closer to the water, maybe a slip-resistant deck, and they could launch boats there or kayaks. Or you could even tie up boats on the transient need to the island. Finally, the last two, the Octagon and South Point Park, the travel time on this was still pretty good. We did have adequate space for supporting necessary upland services. We know that it's in terms of the permitting, it could be permitted because there was a proposed site there that did receive all of the DEC and Army Corps permits, so that's a good indication that could be permitted again. And it's closer to the residential areas of the island. Cons are it's not as really centrally located to the overall transportation hub. You can't just get off there and get onto a subway by walking. You still have the fact that you have rock sockets for the piles. Rock is generally high, and that applies to most of these options anyway. And again, maintenance of the dock will be a little higher. Finally, South Point Park site, it benefits mostly the Cornell because it's so close to there, but it's generally away from the rest of the transportation and the residential areas of the island in the south. So we really settled in on the observation pier and the oil dock as our top two. I know you can't read this, but it's color coded for a reason.
Looks like it's ready for Christmas. All you have to do is not read the green ones.
The green ones are the way the criteria went in terms of our evaluation criteria on the left and the sites across the top. The evaluation criteria, we didn't want to get into something too subjective where our opinion could be taken and adjusted. Like if we had a 6-point scale, somebody would say, oh, that's not a 3, that's a 4. So we generally worked with a 3-point scale, which means that green was ideal for that criteria, Yellow was not ideal, but it was still workable, and red was, this is not an ideal, there are problems that generally result from that. And we're lining them up, observation down to South Point. The two red ones that we had for construction, for the observation pier, we thought that MTA, that subway, and the electrical lines that are over there, that could put a crimp in the schedule on trying to get this developed and get this through. So that we thought was a negative to the ease of construction of a site. And then waterfront recreation, you see that applies for the observation, the octagon, but mostly because they're on the west side of the channel. But you can see that in terms of the ferry service, that received a lot of, in our opinion, well tied into our criteria that we were evaluating when it comes to the service itself. So we developed some opinions of costs for the construction. I'll get to that on the next slide, but our criteria for developing those costs, what do we want to include? Well, we looked at costs from the construction that we've been involved in at Pier 11, at North Williamsburg, and some work over at Fulton Landing. We've done a lot of reinstallation, putting in new piles, redoing the ramps. We were the resident engineers from the North Williamsburg, so we had access to all the costs and all the bids. So we had a really good idea of what the costs were going to be for the actual physical construction. So we pulled costs from there, put a 15% contingency on that because we're still in these early stages. Added some costs in for engineering, design, and construction, which was, I think, in the range of 6 or 8% of the total cost. Put in a construction administration. I'm not sure how Roosevelt Island handles some of this work, but a lot of the work we do for the city, they usually bring on a bigger firm like Tishman or Turner to manage the overall project and to administer all of the work and be out there on site during the whole process. And then we also included any upland work or amenities that we felt were necessary. So I don't have all the details in the presentation, but these are big numbers. These are our estimates of where we think that the construction costs would be. And the breakdown is in the report overall. They're high numbers. I can tell you that the work over at North Williamsburg alone was like $3 million or something like that. So it's pretty expensive, but I threw in all of the costs for the soft costs as well that may be involved in a project like this.
And this is without any kind of recreational area around it or anything, just the dock and the...
It's the dock, but it's upland amenity, like it's preparation for queuing area, ticket booths, especially over at the oil dock. We had some work to do in that area. That pier itself really needs to be replaced if we're going to have an area to utilize for yes.
We always heard that the west side was always, the currents were very strong and it wouldn't be conducive for this ferry service. That was incorporated in this analysis.
We talked to Waterway and they said they would be able to do it, and they're the operators that would be able to do it. The currents are pretty strong on the east side too. We do have some pretty heavy currents over there as well.
Did you speak to the Coast Guard about getting permitting?
We did not speak to the Coast Guard, but we did look through we received from Fernando the permit package that was applied for the Octagon, and that did go through their review, and that was permitted on
My
that
understanding is that the Coast Guard.
We're having discussions.
If they're relevant, it's okay.
Okay.
Okay, you can repeat the question.
No, my understanding was the last time I spoke to the Coast Guard that they were not going to allow any more permits for docks in the East Channel.
On the west
Channel,
west side of the channel.
West Channel. That's my understanding.
Okay.
Just
I-
as a point of information.
I'm
I
going to
could be
show
wrong,
one other thing that we did kind of I didn't show to you, Fernando. It was something that Stuart and I last time we were here kind of thought of that may be a possibility for two things. One, to possibly move that ferry that would have to be there out of harm's way per se, and also to maybe cut down dramatically on the cost. The only thing is that it's an idea. It's not something that's been done for the ferry service before. But I'm going to show you what we were kind of thinking of. And Stu put this together with a 3D modeling software. If we were able to put to the side, within the pier headline, if you want to call it, of the observation pier, we may be able to put a fixed structure. And I know that most of them are not fixed and mostly floating barges. We may be able to put, this is in plan view, where maybe the racks move up and down with the tide, and there's no barge, and the transition happens on the ramp. And this would all have to be designed. You'd actually have to look at the ramp lengths to maintain ADA compliance. and how would you support that ramp? Maybe we have some kind of pulley system. But you could put maybe a floating system that floats the guides and it floats the ramp itself. And that would be a dramatically lower cost, probably about 25% of the other costs. And now you could tuck it in, so you're not nearly within the channel overall. You would have to put alongside, right here, you'd have to put those donut fenders I was showing you before. You'd have to do it so you prevented the ferries from getting too close to the riprap that surrounds the island.
Is that the system at the World Financial Center?
The World Financial Center is still a floating barge on the over Barry Park City. Yeah, that's still a floating barge. But they do have those dolphins. You'll see that those monopile dolphins are pretty much everywhere now. If the Coast Guard, if that was a deal breaker, even with something where we tried to mitigate that, then the next spot would have to be the oil dock.
I mean, I would just say that, given the conversations that I've had with the Coast Guard, that if they're the ones who have to issue the permit, and my understanding, I would just check it before you go any further, because, otherwise you're wasting your time.
Yeah, well, this was really...
Sure, no, I understand. I understand. I'm just, I could be wrong. I'm just saying that that's the conversation that I've had with them, but maybe things have changed. It was a while ago that I had the conversation.
That permit for that set from the Octagon was 2003 or 2004.
Right. It might have been later, but it was. They said that the Octagon, the permit that they gave to the Octagon, was the last permit that they were going to allow in the West Channel.
Okay.
All right, well, we can look into that, can't we?
Yes, we can. I think that this might be something that could be evaluated as another alternative. But if this didn't work at the observation pier, our recommendation would be the next spot would be the oil dock in terms of location.
Okay, I think we're going to hold questions till the end then.
Okay. To review...
Let you folks know I'm on the call.
Okay, Michael.
Michael Shinazaki.
And for the record, Michael Shinazaki, member of the Operations Committee, has joined the meeting
By phone.
by phone.
The observation pier, for us, appears to be the most suitable location, provided we can work out the permitting for placing that on the west channel of the East River. There may be some alternatives for mitigating the cost, like we had talked about with that other type of construction. And it's just so you have a perspective on the cost, the schedule on something of this nature. It's our opinion that this is 12 to 18 months, and the 12 months, that's from a notice to proceed to start work. I think 12 months you would really have to say is an aggressive timeline to actually do that. It's probably more in the range of 18 months is more realistic in our opinion. I believe that's open presentation, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you have.
One of the criteria was near the transportation hub, and I'm just curious why. Well, it seems to make sense to put all the transportation together.
Yes.
Why does that matter for something like this?
For the ability for someone to move from one network to another.
But I don't think that's what we need with the. I mean, for us, it's going to be on and off the island. That's it. It's not going to be so that people from Queens can get here and get off and get into Manhattan, or from Manhattan to get over here and then into Queens.
Well,
basically, we're looking at it for.
You also have people are familiar with transit to getting on and off the island by going to this area, right? That's a primary. So it's a.
Well, yeah, but we could change that in 5 minutes. We only have. We'll just tell people that's where the ferry is, and they'll start going there. I'm just curious if that's a major deal. I would rather see it closer up towards the Octagon, even though it's far from the transportation hub. Well, for a couple of reasons, that's where the people are. But I think mainly, I don't know about you, but I think we need to find out where people want to go on this ferry. Leaving me east of 30 of the drive wouldn't help very much, and I don't know how many people commute. And I assume we're using this as a commuting kind of
thing,
primarily. That's a big question.
I keep thinking of things just after you say them. So.
Well, that's right. A lot of people think.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think first we have to decide: are we using it to commute, and then for recreation purposes as a secondary thing, or is it mainly for recreation as a secondary commute?
Say weekend as opposed to.
Right. Because I think that makes a big difference. We have to find out who really wants to commute to work by ending up on the east side of the drive.
I think that...
You know, because you live on the east side of the drive.
Well, there is a public bus that goes in there.
Right.
Just so you know.
Right.
There's like the ferry buses go, but also the public bus goes there.
Right.
So it is linked back into the...
Where?
At the 34th Street Ferry Terminal.
So anyway, so I think we have to answer that.
Yeah, that's the 34th Street cross town, it's by NYU, right? NYU Mid.
Yeah, exactly,
Or the
exactly.
former
But
NYU.
now they have like a more robust, public link
Check.
to transportation where they didn't have that for a long time, but
Well, I
they do
think
now.
this is the question that Margie is posing her question into. Is this going to be a commuter thing, and should it link with, does it have to be near the tram, and does it have to be near our subway stop? Or will it be used differently, in which case, there might be another place for it besides.
Right. And are there docks anywhere up near the hospitals? Because I would see a greater use for this coming from here over near Cornell. Because Sloan Kettering's near there, Cornell is there, so we have a lot of people who live here, plus the Cornell people will be going back and forth. So on the east side, up further. And
Why would it go to
1670, why 34th as opposed to further up?
Well,
going north?
right now, the
I
only,
mean, I know there's nothing there.
the only other, that's right, there's
Yeah.
not gonna be, the only other landing
That's
is
my
East
question.
90th, which is
Yeah, too far up.
greatly underused as well.
Yes,
It's-
and there are
there's
no plans
hubs
to do
get there.
anything.
Yeah, once you get there, you have to,
Yeah.
it's hard, you have to go through Gracie Mansion, park there to get to another, you almost, that's only really serving the local.
Is there a dock at 23rd Street?
No, there's not, on 23rd Street on the east side, no. Now, the route, just so, I actually have a map of it, I didn't put it up here, but the route is East 34th Street, across over to Queens West, to India Street Pier in Greenpoint, to North Williamsburg, back down to Schaefer Landing, right outside of Brooklyn Navy Yard, and down to Dumbo, right outside of Brooklyn Bridge Park, and then across to Pier 11, and then back around. Again, that's the current route that's there.
Does it reverse, or does it just loop directly up to 34th from there?
It goes right back and reverses. It doesn't go run straight up. Everybody gets on and it goes back the exact opposite way. It doesn't run quickly up to 34th and then go slowly the other way. So there's no reverse commute where they go slowly one way and quick again. They go right back and forth that same loop each time.
So was it,
Hang on 1 second, April. Anybody else on the board have, or on the committee have any more
Not
questions?
right now, no.
Okay, we'll just open up to the public for a few quick ones.
The stationary pier was 25% of the cost of the floating pier. Is that what it said?
I think it could be a dramatically lower cost to do that. The barge is $1 million alone. The barge is $1 million to repair that. Then $500,000 and all of the amenities that go on it, those ramps that raise and lower. It all has to be. Electrical system has to feed all those ramps. Usually, it's a large barge. It's usually 30 by 90, 35 by 70. So that cost would come down. A big item cost here is rock around the island is very high. You can't drive a pile and say it's in, we can move on. You actually have to literally core a hole in the rock down, usually 15 feet, set the other pile in, and then fill it with grout or concrete. So it's like sitting in
both
there.
sides? I'm sorry, is it both sides of the island? I mean, if we put an oil dock.
Even the oil dock, we did have better records on the oil dock, and rock was high there. They actually used H piles when they were driving, and they had to, rock is still high over there. I think part of the further taking this to, I guess, phase 3 is, refining these sites from what we provided. If you feel the criteria are not in the right order, that can be reevaluated. A narrowed down selection, and maybe the top 2 in terms of the short list. A boring program, or maybe a little bit more detailed analysis is done before you select it. But the rock sockets are, I think we use $200,000 a pile or somewhere in that range. They're very expensive to put in. I mean, you've seen the rigs around the harbor. To drill a hole that's 4 inches is big. To drill one that's 4 foot diameter, 15 feet deep in the currents of the East River is pretty hard.
Steve, based on these various, we've seen a range of from $5 million to $7 million roughly. When might we be able to budget for a thing like this?
We'll evaluate it next year, I guess. It could, we have the capital budget going forward for the next 15 years. We'll have to see, sit down and see some projects that maybe we wouldn't do. We'll see where maybe possible other funding sources. And, if it's 25% of the $5 million, if we're looking at something like that's $1 million, and if it's actually doable, that's actually, would be great.
It's the thing that's different about it, and we didn't have it in there, is you can't find one around the harbor. It'd be a little bit trickier to do, but if we could save millions and millions of dollars and make it work, I think it's an option that would be good, especially if it can help bring us into a more favorable position with the Coast Guard where we can tuck the ferry in overall. I don't know if it would do too much to the schedule, but it's something that I think could be considered. I wouldn't throw it out there. I think some logistics where you'd actually have to look at the elevations and the slopes and the ramps, and a quick design on that would be a way to evaluate if it is in that range.
Is there any place that they are using that kind of thing?
That not New York Harbor.
But anywhere else in the
I'd have to look to see. You do see ones that aren't floating, but they're more for the DOT type ferry system, like Staten Island Ferry. Those are where the ramp comes down and they come into a protected one. So there's no floating system there. But those are Staten Island Ferry, Governor's Island, the ones that run to Hard Island, or all those traditional
tremendous piling walls to catch the ferry.
to catch them coming in. Yeah, the currents there they're pretty good, but it's amazing. We've seen the ferry operators are very competent, and provided we provide them those resting dolphins, protect them from going into the riprap, it could be something that could work.
Given the storm we just had, Sandy,
Yes.
is one side of the would one side of the island be slightly more protected, and what would the result of that storm be if this were put in on either side? On a dock.
To answer your first question, I don't feel there's either difference, because the big item that was the problem was the storm surge, the raise in the elevation overall. You're still going to see the same currents. They handled great. The ferry system was up and running 2 days later, and the only reason it was 2 days was because the city had so many other priorities that they were dealing with first. We got a call on Wednesday, and we went around to all the sites and took a look at them. The thing they did to prepare for them is they took the ferry. They had contractors come around and take the gangways that lead from land off, because they don't generally handle the huge angles that they're. So they took them off. They have these actually quick disconnect electrical systems, just like plugging into a wall, but for 220 volts or what have you. They unplugged those, took the ramps, put them on the barge, and did that for all of them, and then picked them back up and put them on, and they were in operation. We actually designed the tops of the piles. I'm going to say luckily, but we put them up to plus 22, and if you looked at the rub marks on them, they got up within a couple feet of the top of them, but it stayed on there. So
plus 22 meaning the rise.
22 feet of water above mean lower water in the harbor. We had plus 14 in the harbor, and then if you figure the freeboard, the height from the water line to those things is about 6 feet. So we're up about 20 feet above low water was where they were. Another 3 or 4 feet, and some of the tugs would have been chasing ferry barges around the harbor to pick them up and put them back where they were. So
Okay, take two more, and then we'll go. Very quick.
Yeah, I think user interest would be dependent in large measure on the cost for the riders. Do you have any anticipation as to what the cost per rider might be?
I think it would be the existing. It would probably be the existing route, because their assumption would probably be at waterways that people were getting onto the network, and it's one flat fee. I think it's $4.50. I'm sorry, I don't have the number off my head. I think it's $4.50 getting on, and you get off anywhere on that network. There's monthly passes that you can buy as well. But I think if you were to any lower than that, it would change the dynamics of how you transferred on. I would actually suspect you get on a shuttle, get onto one of the ferries, and not even leave the barge. You transfer right on to another ferry at 34th. If you had a lower rate to go to 34th and then another rate, they'd have to get off, re-queue. It might complicate things. So I'm not sure how that would work. I think that's more of a detail.
Would it be tied into MetroCard?
They're not tied into MetroCard, they're independent. I know that has been discussed with EDC, but right now it's an independent one. You can get an app for it, you can buy your tickets like a same kind of kiosk at the subway.
Yeah, no, I'm going to stop this now because we're pretty far from that.
Okay.
We will find out.
Just when New York Water Taxi came here a couple of years ago with Tom Fox,
Yes.
he had mentioned something about a spud barge for the water taxi, and it would cost about $500,000 to $750,000.
Yep.
Did you look at that?
You cannot spud a barge down in the currents without socketing those piles. Normally a spud barge comes in and they drive the piles down to secure them in place. There's rock. If you could show that there was 30 feet of competent sand above the rock to embed into, that might work. But the water depths, I don't know if I have it in very deep water depths on the west side, shallower on the east, but again, if rock is high, you can't, they hit, you'll be in the ground, they won't tow in, and with the forces of 3 or 4 knots of current on a floating barge, especially with a ferry on it pushing, we won't hold it in place. It won't. We use spud barges like that. The one over at Rockaway right now, the temporary one, that's exactly what they did. But they have sands, they have rock way deep, and they were able to do that.
Okay, Aaron, last one, then we're gonna go to the next topic.
Specifically to you, Margie, the Octagon location, if your purpose, one of the purpose of the ferry is to relieve the congestion on our existing off-island transportation system, the Octagon would be a terrible location because I can tell you from informal surveys we've already made, virtually no one from Southtown or Northtown would take the red bus up to the Octagon in order to get on a ferry. It will not be attractive.
Okay.
You'll defeat your purpose.
Okay, anybody else here? We go to the next topic.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What's, Fernando, what's required from this committee at
Yeah,
this point?
that's what I wanted to ask. in terms
Are
of-
these, is your slide presentation available online?
I'll send a PDF to
And
Fernando.
we'll put it on our website,
to me.
and then I'll circulate it to the committee as well.
So, while we clear out on which, what is required of this committee?
Well, we heard the presentation, of course, and the 4 options, and I think the 2 primary locations would be the observation location and the oil dock. So it seems to me, from what I heard from the presentation and some of the questions that were asked, is that there needs to be a little bit more feedback or analysis done in terms of costs and really drill down on those locations and the viability and so on.
Well,
So-
I think we gotta step back though and say, what are we doing this for?
Mhm.
The commuter ferry, and if it is, who wants to commute?
Right, and that would be
Place, and
part
that's
of, that would be part of,
question one.
right,
Something else we need to know, yeah?
right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at this point, Ocean and Coastal, and thank you, Stephen, for the presentation this evening, they've completed their analysis in
Right.
terms of what we asked. If the committee wishes to continue and to engage Ocean and Coastal to take a look at, these 2 locations. Let's find out what the main goal is or what the main objective, and are we achieving that by these locations? But that's something that we would have to discuss with Ocean and Coastal.
That's our
We get a
second
proposal.
question. Margie posed the first question.
Yeah, first we have to find out from the
Ferry.
people on the island, who need a ferry.
Okay.
I mean, we all like the idea of
Yeah,
it.
it sounds like a great idea, but in reality, I'm not sure it is. We had it before, we didn't use it that much, now we have more people, that may have changed. But I just wanna get a feel.
And
for it.
attitude make, and a lot of
Yeah,
things,
a lot of
we
things
don't
change.
know that.
Right.
We're
When
being fuddy-duddies.
right. When we did the tram modernization project, we looked at we did a survey in terms of would there be interest in the ferry service, and the general feedback was yes, but then the prohibitive factor was that the cost to ride the ferry.
I
So-
think it's the cost of the location, I mean, I would have said yes too, but not to 34th Street, and not if it's gonna cost $5 million.
For instance.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think we need a different kind of survey.
Also, I distrust any survey that we create. We're not professional polls,
Mm-hmm.
and we have no expertise that I know of to write, and conduct, and then interpret the results of a survey. It's just my feeling, because anybody I ask, yeah, we should have a ferry.
Yeah, sure, why not? I'll take
I
one too.
just to add, the East River Ferry Service is still subsidized by the city. I think that's an important thing to know. It's not, they're not profitable charging $4.50 a rider still.
Matt is actually asking 2 questions. He asked, what's the cost per trip? You gave him a ticket price.
I gave you a ticket price. I don't know what the actual cost is.
There was something on the Times recently. I think we're subsidizing those riders to about 2 ferries or more. Something like that. Cost like $10.
Maybe part of the evaluation is after you figure out, sorry if I'm speaking out, but maybe after you figure out the potential of the riders and who would be interested and the quantity of people that would utilize it, you can maybe back into the number that it has to be to build it, that makes it, there's a return on investment. You might say it has to be $500,000 and then it's a non-starter.
We're
But if
a
you come to
government, we
one,
don't need return on investment. Actually, I'm not kidding.
Maybe you can't do a trial thing here,
Yeah.
temporary.
Return on investment.
Okay.
Okay?
All right, thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much.
So that I understand what's the next step, so what would the committee like to do? Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
I would ask a question, Margie, may I ask a question of
You may ask
some of our
anything you'd
visitors
like.
and observers here?
Yes, you may.
Because these are all interesting people that have been involved with things. How would we go about determining really how to, whether or not we need a ferry, whether it would actually be used or it's just a nice idea?
Yeah, I have a comment. Nobody's mentioned tourism,
That's right.
and you just mentioned that you had 1,800 people at the park last weekend. That's a lot of people. And a lot of those people will use the ferry service. And looking at the businesses that we want to have here, if you had them, for instance, dropped off at the Octagon, take that beautiful walk down the river to the park, and then they get on another transportation to go home, or vice versa. They go to the park, they walk up to the Octagon to take the ferry. A lot of people like to take the ferry. And it would bring a lot of people to the island to spend money, especially if we had signs that brought them into town to have lunch. People can spend a day here when we have businesses open.
Got a subway. They may not have that where they live.
But, you know, I think that that's something to really need to look at, because if we want to have great stores here, we need to bring these people here, and the ferry is something that will bring
Can I just
people.
tell my response to that?
Yeah.
You're saying it has to be part and parcel of a larger concept of who we want to bring to the island, and is this a good way to bring them in? Okay. At least that was my response.
Yeah.
Hang on, Steve, I want to hear from.
I think you've already had the survey. I want to tell you, as far as island people using it, it's going to be strictly dependent on the cost. So, you know, if the fare is $10, you can virtually no one's going to use it. If the fare is $3, you'll get a lot of people. You know, we know that.
No, we
From
don't
the-
know that now.
We took a number of surveys.
And you told them
I'm-
that they were gonna get left east of the drive with a ferry?
No,
That's the
34th
big
Street,
difference.
34th Street is a very good location, because from 34th Street, you can go virtually any place in Manhattan. There are buses up and down town, there are buses that will connect to the various subway systems. It's a central location.
Well, that's an opinion.
That's yes.
You asked about methodology for a survey, and having done a couple of them, there are two prime opportunities with Rick and Dick through the blog and through the newspaper. Whatever is the easiest way for people to respond is the best way of doing it, obviously. The least effort upon anybody will get you the largest return. And if you can get a return of about 10%, 12 to 1,400 people responding, that's statistically significant, so that would be a goal.
12 to 1,400 seems to be the turnout for everything we do.
Pretty much.
You know, this is really long-term too. It's not something we have to act upon right now. At least we did a study, we know what the possible costs would be. But eventually, I think, long-term, a third mode of transportation is something that, you know, probably at some point we're gonna need. And this ferry service will probably be a lot more expanded at some time. So, as for the next step, we could see if we could get other funding sources, maybe some other stakeholders wanted to participate, or maybe, you know, but at least we have an idea of what the cost is. And doesn't mean we have to make a decision right now of which way to go, whatever, but at least, you know.
What I really hear is, what I'm hearing you say is that as part of our thinking about do we need a subway subway ferry, subway anywhere else, is future usage.
Yeah, you know, it's something that maybe 5 years down the line will need a lot more, maybe, you know, and it would have to be updated, the cost would be more, of course, and so forth, but, you know, if there's something that's like $1 million, that's, you know, we'll have to see if we, you know, if we can get some kind of funding, maybe we can co-fund it, maybe it costs $500,000, maybe at that point, maybe it makes sense to really pursue it at this point, so.
We also have to check with the Coast Guard to see
Oh, right.
Well, yeah, if the West Waterway is not feasible, there's no reason to keep studying it. But the point Steve made about stakeholders is a very good point. There's other private interests that have stakeholders on the island, and I think most of those stakeholders, if we did have a ferry, would benefit tremendously from it. So, you know, if we do consider doing this, I think it would be very prudent going forward, if we did, to involve, you know, the various other stakeholders in the discussions and see what they may be willing to contribute.
Yeah, so it becomes part of a bigger picture, which is a good way not to do anything short term. Otherwise, we say we have to wait till all our plans are in place for everything. It may make sense just to go ahead, but I'm sorry.
Okay. Michael, anything from you? Michael?
Well, sorry, I picked your presentations, but it depends on when you say short term, long term, medium term. Is short term like 0 to 2 years, and medium term is 5 to 10, and long term is 10 and beyond?
We'll have to decide that
is
too.
probably more of a medium.
That will have to be part of our thinking.
Yeah. So that's what we have to figure out.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we're going to be able to do it right away. Because if I remember the scuba survey they did, engineering survey of the oil dock, says that that dock was not found.
Yeah, he mentioned that's why the oil dock location would be the most expensive. Is essentially they'd have to replace the whole dock before they went on from there.
Yeah.
So you're right.
Okay. We know where we're going. We go on to the next